All right. Hello and welcome to our final class meeting of the quarter. I know we're really close to the end. People have exams, other things, travel and such going on. So I'm going to try to keep today's class a bit more relaxed, end things a little bit early, and use today's class more as a recap of the broader things that we've discussed and a way to help you to prepare for the final assignments. So today, we'll be doing a quick review of things to know from the class. Remember that we have some major assignments coming up, the listening debrief on the 19th, along with the last 2 weeks of quizzes, and then the extra credit opportunity if you choose to complete that. Remember that 319 is the hard cutoff, because after that I'll need to submit your grades so that you'll have all of those officially entered. Also, I did give you some time earlier in the week to complete the course evals in class. If you haven't done so, like you weren't there on Monday or didn't have access to a device, you should have received an email on the 27th or 28th. Please take the time to do so by the end of the day if you haven't already completed those. And what I'd like you to do for attendance today is just to take a couple minutes on your own to write or type, given the remaining assignments that we discussed earlier in the class, what remaining things do you need to work on, and what might be your kind of strategy or timeline to getting those things in by the 9th. So I'll just give you a couple minutes to brainstorm, think about what we'll need to do to wrap things. So your banjo accompaniment. I'll give you a couple minutes to finish up. All right. So again, I wanted to give you a little bit of time to just think about and plan for this class, the remaining things that you'll need to do. Just knowing that, again, that you have the listening debrief, the last couple quizzes, and the extra credit if you choose to do that. The other thing, just as a reminder, if you've missed more than 3 classes, to complete those makeup assignments for classes that you've missed as well, just to help you with getting everything you need to get the grade that you'd like. So I want to do a quick recap of last class before we get into an overall debrief of the course. You're talking about the Lloyd readings and the limits of listening and ways that we compare listening with action. I had you all divided into groups to explore some of the sections of this article, which I will admit are not especially well written, and I think are a little convoluted, but I think you all did a great job of parsing out some of the key ideas and observations out of it. We talked about the idea, as we mentioned last class, right, that while we have this kind of public sphere that's put on a pedestal, the opportunity for people to listen and openly communicate, that as we've talked about, access to listening is not necessarily equal, and we need to consider difference in the ways in which barriers can impact people's ability to listen in the first place. If we put listening on a pedestal, not everybody can listen. If you're in a Zoom meeting and you're deaf and there are no ASL interpreters or captions, right? You don't get to listen in the way that other people might be able to in that meeting. And we talked about this idea that listening can be a way to engage in issues, but that we feel this kind of a listener's block or wall that we hit if all we're doing is listening, we're not doing any sort of action to resolve issues. And it's this difficult line to walk because sometimes, especially in an interpersonal context, people say, hey, I just want to listen and be listened to. I don't want you to focus on a solution. But especially when we think about organizational and structural issues, action can be a way to really engage with different topics that might come up, right? If we're involved in an international conflict over resources and distribution of those resources, listening's only going to get us so far. So I want to do a review just to recap what we went over the course of the class, because I am asking you to share some of the major things you learned and also to apply some of these things for your final assignment in class or your listening debrief. So consider this kind of a helpful thing to let you know what to draw from for your final presentation or your final paper in the class. In the first week of class, we talked about what listening is. Remember that listening is this 5-stage process, right? That we get information in a sensory basis, we're hearing, we're seeing it, etc. We understand and know what that message is. We remember it, it's in our brains, and we hang on to it for later. We evaluate it, we critically consider if the message is good, what the message means, and so on. And then we use feedback as a way of verbally or non-verbally confirming that we're listening and understanding, like nodding our head. So we talked about those kind of fundamental face-to-face elements of listening and the ways in which listening can happen, either through the ability to listen empathetically, to listen actively, and so on. In the second week, right, we talked about some of the ways that listening doesn't go so well, right? So I've been seeing some videos where people will like have a cardboard cutout of themselves that they post to Zoom to make it look like they're in the meeting and they're actually sleeping. Probably an example of bad listening, right? So mental roadblocks can impact our ability to listen and to engage. That will use things like selective listening or pseudo listening, where we're nodding, saying uh-huh, and giving feedback that doesn't really correspond to the message, right? And we talked about how to create a better environment, recognizing we're human beings, we have physiological needs that are going to impact how attentive and involved we are in listening, and some of the ways that we can improve those things. So the first couple of weeks, we're really getting into those nuts and bolts that you could definitely draw from here for your listening assessment. During week 3, we transitioned to talking about media, right? How outlets such as Twitter can be opportunities for people to listen and to engage online. We talked about how organizations, right, and companies, including a lot of companies with social media accounts, right, will use that to listen to the public. People will oftentimes like write reviews, Google reviews, and so on, right, and use sort of that response as a way to gauge attention and figure out how to improve or change their products. So, companies have to engage with social media in order to stay afloat, and developing good strategies to listen to the needs of consumers is crucial. During the fourth week, we were talking about professionalism, right? The idea that when we are in our jobs or clubs or organizations and gear up for continuing to do so later in life, right, that we find these professional work opportunities as crucial spaces for listening. I really liked the idea that was brought up in a group that you could use something like an anonymous feedback form or drop-off to assess listening, how listening is happening in a professional space, right? Listening is very under-discussed and undervalued in a professional context. We're oftentimes told, by somebody like a boss or something, we should be good listeners. We're not really told how to be good listeners or what makes for good listening. So listening is sort of taken for granted and considered to be a thing that people should do, but we don't understand what good listening might be. So I really appreciated you all's brainstorming and thoughts about how we can use listening in those professional settings. During week 5, we moved over to the Ratcliffe piece that was discussing rhetorical listening. Rhetorical listening is a framework that you can use if you wanted to for your own listening debrief. It's the idea, right, that listening is persuasive. It does have some level of impact and influence on us. And that rhetorical listening is a process by which we can consider how differences, including culture, gender, and so on, shape the way that we interpret and can understand messages, right? For instance, sustained eye contact in one culture might be seen as a sign of respect, but sustained eye contact to somebody of higher authority in particularly a lot of cultures in Asia is not necessarily seen as a good thing, right? It might be seen as disrespectful. So there's a lot of different ways that our own listening is shaped by culture. Also, the idea that listening is oftentimes gendered, that disproportionately women are told to listen and men are told to act or to talk, right? So we were trying to discuss the ways to challenge some of the gendered assumptions about who can listen and what listening looks like. In the 6th week, we transitioned to talking about listening politically and socially, something that we don't do a whole lot, right? The idea here, if you can think about some of the 4 different categories that we outlined, the idea of enclave listening being one of them, that we communicate for people that are in very similar groups or organizations to us, but also the way that we can communicate across difference and use things like adversarial listening to understand, sort of gain intelligence about what a disagreeing perspective has to say. You talked a little bit about this idea of the public sphere having this open space for people to talk about and deal with issues today that we don't really see anymore, right? But that it's a starting point to understand that we do not have this open space for discussion and disagreement. We instead have these sort of enclave spaces, including digital spaces that shape our listening to, right? Listening is not necessarily about persuasion. If somebody is sharing a view that is deeply held and substantially disagrees with your own, right? You might understand better, but you might not necessarily be persuaded yourself. During week 7, we were talking about how listening was shaped by race. So, of course, race is a fundamental component of what it means to listen and create listenable messages, right? Historically, considering the sort of marginalization, violence, and underrepresentation, the ability to even be seen as somebody worth listening to is incredibly impacted and shaped by race. And we talked about how history and context has built spaces for listening on the basis of so many differences. Looking at things like the history and significance of Black-owned radio in the United States and how things like media ownership, right, could shape or constrain the ability to listen and to participate. So a couple weeks ago, we talked a little bit about space and place, right? We talked about this case study that was looking at Gibraltar, pictured here on the right, this kind of odd island community where there's this combination of British and Spanish occupation. And as a result, there's this very eclectic and culturally diverse set of experiences among its people. And in this way, were locations, including EOU, right, Eastern Oregon more broadly, and Grand, that location plays such a big role in shaping our communication. The physical place and space offer not only something that impacts your ability to listen, like the acoustics in the room, what is in the room, but also its cultural history, its context, and its importance. If we have somebody, for instance, a political leader that's choosing a location to give a speech or a presentation, they're invoking that use of location as a means of persuasion. When we think about listening, what it means to listen in a place, the sort of hustle and bustle of a town square. And as we saw in this article, right, the like British drumming and parade that was attempting to override that type of listening environment really gets at the role that power and differences can shape our entire listening process. Last week, we talked about listening and accessibility, right? Pictured here on the right would be the use of ASL interpretation in a Zoom meeting. For instance, a lot of Zoom meetings will pin an interpreter. You'll also notice that there is the use of closed captioning that helps for accessibility as well. That oftentimes when we decide, is somebody listening or not listening, that binary doesn't get at the ways in which listening could look very different for people with disabilities. We also talked about how creating an accessible environment is crucial to listening. The structural barriers that can impact our ability to listen and be heard. Again, thinking back to that clip from Trip Camp, where Nancy was sharing a story, but wasn't being listened to or understood outside of another person with cerebral palsy who was able to recollect and share that experience back to the group. So making listening accessible is crucial. And then lastly, we talked about the limits of listening, right? The idea here being that when we listen, that listening is not a cure. It doesn't fix every social, political problem or challenge that we are going to face, right? We can, right, as we've seen with Ukraine, there's been a lot of response, backlash, concern, and so on, right? But I don't necessarily think that somebody holding up a sign that says no war on its own, right, is going to change Putin's mind. So there's a lot of different ways in which listening can do a lot, but we need to acknowledge its limits. That listening needs to be paired with action and with change. And so figuring out how listening fits into the equation is really important. That we can use listening in a lot of situations to better understand and relate to one another and to create that sort of space to do so. But that listening has to acknowledge these kinds of barriers. So kind of thinking about all of the stuff that we've talked about over the course of the quarter, what I kind of want to leave you with are a series of 3 questions that I think help to build on some of the things that we've talked about and can be things for you to consider going forward as you're thinking about, some of the things that this class has helped with regard to listening. How can we value and improve listening as we move forward in our lives, right? We talked about the idea that listening is not something we're really taught to do very much. We're given some basic skills in listening, but we've had a lot more of a detailed sense of what listening looks like and what good listening is, right? So you might think about, if you become a member of a club or organization or occupy a leadership role, how you are prioritizing or seeing listening as important. What kinds of listening are you asking for from people in your group? And how can you use listening effectively? So thinking about valuing and placing listening on an important plane is a crucial element here. Secondarily, we need to think about what it means to listen in context, right? What do we take seriously and listen to? How do things such as biases and preconceptions shape our ability to listen? One major concern, right, is that sometimes we hear somebody who doesn't look like us, who might speak in a way that we might not expect, right? And even though we're trying to be positive and listen well, sometimes our stereotypes and biases can shape the way we listen or take somebody more or less seriously. So it's important for us to think about that and think about what it means to listen in a way that considers cultural difference, identity, and so forth. And then lastly, as we were hitting on toward the end here, how might we pair listening with action? Right? We know that listening can be valuable and that listening has its limits. So when should there be a space to listen when you're involved in a group? For instance, maybe you're talking with a close friend and you say, hey, I'm here for us to listen together. Sometimes, right, you got to draw the line and say, hey, we've done a good job of talking through this and listening together. We need to go forward and address this next issue. So just some things to think about, right, in the limits and boundaries that we might have in the entire listening process. So thank you all for a really great quarter. I really enjoyed your participation and engagement throughout the class. Again, please make sure to complete the remaining assignments by the 19th, and please make sure to complete those evals if you haven't done so already. Go ahead and pass forward or email me your assignments. I hope that you had a great time with your remaining classes and wrapping everything up for the quarter. And I hope you had an awesome and fun spring break. I will be traveling to Hood River to celebrate my 30th birthday, so that'll be fun. So I hope you have a great time, and I will see some of you again in the spring.